the ultimate goal for us as Indigenous activists working in this space is to avoid repeating patterns from the oil and gas extraction and traditional mining in this energy transition. We have this moment. We're at the cusp of this new industrial revolution, and we have the opportunity with that. And the opportunity is to bring Indigenous peoples to the table, to ask for their free, prior informed consent, and allow Indigenous peoples to have the true North Star.
Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet, and holding people in power to account. This podcast was recorded and edited on Gadigal land. Lithium, nickel, cobalt, and copper. These are just four of the minerals commonly used in not just everyday electronics, but in the technology behind much of the global energy transition. The mining for these minerals, however, comes with many negative human and environmental impacts. A recent report by the UN says extraction for raw materials could increase by as much as 60% by 2060. And according to research, nearly 54% of all transition minerals occur on or near Indigenous land. The impacts from mining these metals and the mining industry itself need more detailed coverage, our guests on the newscast say. In this conversation, I speak with Galina Angarova, who is an Indigenous activist from the Buryat community of Russia and the executive director of the SIRGE Coalition, Securing Indigenous Rights in the Green Economy, and environmental reporter Ian Morse. We discuss the aforementioned impacts and the complex geopolitical tensions exacerbated by the concentration of minerals in specific nations. What is FPIC, Free, Prior, and Informed Consent? The protocol for consulting Indigenous people about the impacts proposed mining projects would have on their communities, and why has no country properly enforced it? The discussion you're about to hear was recorded live on Mongabay's YouTube channel and has been lightly edited for clarity. While the conversation was originally intended for a media audience, it is also applicable to audiences worldwide. Regardless of whether you're a journalist, an activist, or a curious Mongabay reader and listener, this discussion provides a lot of insight into the industries and processes behind the materials that power many of the products, such as solar panels, electric vehicles, and batteries, that people use today. All right, so our first question. Currently, there's no universal standard accepted definition or list of critical minerals. We refer to them as transition minerals or transition critical elements or transition metals. So our first question here is, when journalists write a story on these minerals, what terms do you recommend they use? How do we simplify this topic for readers? And anyone is welcome to chime in.
No, I can go first. We've had consultation among various Indigenous-led groups and allied groups who work on the issues of transition minerals and just transition. And for us, the most appropriate term is transition minerals. As we think that the term crucial is the term that has been proposed by the industry, and it creates sort of a false narrative of urgency in our mind. So we prefer and we strongly recommend to use the term transition minerals. That's very short from me.
And then I can chime in. So my approach is, because there's all these different ways of designating which minerals are critical or for the energy transition, is that whenever I refer to them or need to refer to generally the minerals that are used in technologies that are meant to save the climate or whatever that may be, what I would prefer to do is use a kind of long descriptor like that, because there's a lot of assumptions within something like energy transition minerals or critical minerals. One is that, so the term critical minerals for a country like the US, plus some others who have lists of or use the term critical minerals, they don't only refer to climate technologies or climate action, it's also about military applications. So if you want to refer just to the climate ones, like ensure that it is energy transition or linked to certain technologies those technologies being ones that companies want to sell for climate action. And again, that's a long descriptor, but my approach is to typically hedge, because when we assume that, say, nickel, for example, is a transition mineral, the vast majority of the market itself is not directly linked to EV batteries. It's mostly linked to steel, which is in construction, but steel is also in cars. It's also in wind turbines. So there's a range of different uses for any one material, and the market itself reacts to not only what's happening within climate action, but also what military applications exist and are being developed, as well as more conventional construction ones, things like that. So it's really hard to, at any one time, when you're referring to these, to make clear that any one of these minerals is used in a variety of applications, not all of which are connected to climate. And because it's so difficult, it's likely best to try to hedge a bit more, because, at least in my opinion, when we keep using the kind of critical minerals or climate minerals, things like that, it gives a lot of moral weight to the mining of something that may actually never go into a climate technology. And that's not even questioning the idea that, like batteries or EVs, they are climate technology, but they may not be the best kinds, because it's all about the rollout and everything there. So there's a lot of moral weight there when we refer to something as an energy transition mineral or climate mineral. And so be aware of that, I think, as you're going into it. Be aware also that, like, when speaking with companies or officials or anyone else, that if they use these terms, it's okay to separate that out a bit and give a bit more description and be asked a few more questions.
Those are fantastic responses. So with that said, I'm going to move on to the next question. So the concentration of transition minerals is relegated to a relatively small number of countries on the globe, and a few key minerals like lithium, cobalt, copper, and nickel. So what are some other key minerals, and what are the countries that we're referring to here? And what kind of geopolitical barriers to cooperation does this dynamic present?
Maybe I can start here. I wanted to start talking about the geopolitical tensions and escalation that we are experiencing these days. I recently published an article, actually last week, about the geopolitical implications of the energy transition and impacts on indigenous peoples associated with that. But what I wanted to mention here is that China remains to be the dominant refiner of copper and nickel and other minerals, and it has built its capacity for vertical integration, and it controls different stages of production along their supply chains. And at the same time, the United States and other countries, EU, for example, are largely dependent on China for processing and are therefore rushing to disentangle their supply chains from China at all costs, it seems like. And this political escalation is leading to more violence against indigenous peoples. And again, I just wanted to preface here, like, I'm an indigenous rights activist, and so a lot of the research and findings and statements that we do as part of the SIRGE Coalition is coming from the lens of indigenous people's rights. And of course, like, a lot of the things that we say and put forward is going to be in protection for the rights of indigenous peoples. So I would like this point and views to be really highlighted in a lot of the communications and publications, but also I'm cognizant of the fact that this is just one perspective, right? Then I also wanted to refer our audience to the Aspen Institute's Critical Minerals Report. I think it has a lot of good information about the countries where the deposits of transition minerals are. Let's say copper, it's Chile, Peru, and Democratic Republic of Congo. Lithium is Australia, Chile, and China. Nickel is Indonesia, Philippines, Russia. Cobalt, Democratic Republic of Congo, Indonesia, and Australia. So you will be able to find that information in the report. What I also wanted to mention that the concentrated production of these minerals places supply chain at several risk of disruption from unintentional supply shocks, which could result from events such as political instability or natural disasters, or intentional supply shocks, which could result from production cuts or export restrictions. And these risks are increasingly likely as the world moves away from globalization into an era in which trade wars, nationalizations, and geopolitical tensions promise to feature more prominently. So the early signs of disruption are already taking place. So the same report mentions that in Latin America, Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile specifically, they are reportedly considering forming lithium cartels. Although these effects and likelihood of a cartel are uncertain, a lithium cartel could threaten to limit lithium production, both from lower levels of private investment and efforts to control output. Also, news from Peru that there are some cases of political instability in Peru, so that might pose a predicament for supply disruptions. Other countries like Myanmar recently imposed a ban on tin exports, and Indonesia has banned exports of nickel concentrate. So these things are happening. In my recent interaction, I was in Chile last month. I was meeting with a number of stakeholders, players, and what we've learned is that there is already a move in Chile towards nationalization and state-owned companies taking over the production of lithium. And while it might seem like, what would you say, a good move for the country itself to provide sort of national security, but it's not good news for indigenous communities, because there is a inherent conflict between the state and indigenous peoples. And there's a lot less leverage for indigenous peoples in a case when an industry is nationalized. There's just very difficult to sit around the table with representatives of a state and the state-owned companies and negotiate free, prior, informed consent protocol with such players. Finally, I wanted to say that China's dominant role in critical minerals processing is the result of decades of targeted industrial policy, which has significantly subsidized domestic industry, invested heavily in research and development, and focused on workforce development. These policies coincided with decades of globalization and the gradual offshoring of the U.S. mining and processing industry, in addition to downstream manufacturing industry. So U.S. And EU are currently really rushing to disentangle those supply chain and build those relationship with resource-rich countries directly. But at the same time, as we're looking into the consequences of such disentanglement, we believe that indigenous peoples will be on the front lines and bear the risks of such rush and the disentanglement of the supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you, Galina.
Yeah, so then I can add just a few things. That was a good answer. So some of the things I could mention are, like, in addition to the countries that Galina mentions that are on the radar for certain minerals, there's also where capital is held. Those places are also technically mining countries. So places like the UK, Switzerland, Canada, the US as well. There's a lot of companies there based on stock exchanges that have public records, but they control mines that are in places like Indonesia or the Congo. And those places deserve also a lot of focus as well, because there's a lot of opportunity for regulators to be involved there. There's opportunity for the public records, the disclosures from companies to be assessed by journalists. And so those places are also, in my mind, mining countries, even though they don't mine their own lands, because those are places that, hold control over lands in what's typically the global south. So in addition to that, when we spoke about the critical minerals before, these are lists that countries have devised. They change roughly every year. at least for the US. And there are minerals on there that are very important, but aren't often on there, as well as ones that are on there that don't seem to be that important, especially for climate things. So one is like phosphates, and I've written about phosphate before because this is something, it's a kind of mineral where there are a number of people within the industry that are afraid of the supplies that are available around the world, because in addition to its agricultural use as a fertilizer, there's also increased use within EV batteries themselves. And so the combination of agriculture plus batteries is a reason to say that, phosphate could also be a climate mineral as well. And that would then put the focus on places like Florida or Morocco, where a lot of production happens. But it also is like a larger question about what we define as a climate mineral and what places we see as valid places to mine or to be assessed for mining. So yeah, we can leave it there just to make sure to move on to other questions maybe.
Yeah, let's go ahead and move on to the next question. Those are fantastic responses. So let's talk about windfalls here for a second. So the IMF estimates that in a net zero emissions pathway, prices of 4 transition metals, lithium, copper, cobalt, and nickel, could generate revenues similar to the oil sector over the next 20 years. So what kind of complications could a windfall there present that journalists should be paying attention to?
So I'll start with the major complication that the SIRGE Coalition is really paying attention to is the risk for Indigenous peoples. When talking to the private sector, to companies, end user companies, mining companies, we talk about Indigenous peoples' rights risk. And I just wanted to say what it is. The ultimate goal for us as Indigenous activists working in the space is to avoid repeating patterns from the oil and gas extraction and traditional mining in this energy transition. Right? We have this moment, we're at the cusp of this new industrial revolution, and we have the opportunity with that. And the opportunity is to bring Indigenous peoples to the table, to ask for their free, prior informed consent and allow Indigenous peoples to have the true North Star as their guiding star, the star of true self-determination and the ability to decide their cultural, political, and other priorities. Because companies are not scoping for Indigenous peoples' rights risk, be it transition minerals mining, battery production, EV manufacturing, the full range of harms and rights violations will continue to be perpetuated against Indigenous peoples, which translates to material, legal, and reputational risks for companies. And that's what we put in front of the private sector when we have meetings with them. I want to give 4 examples when Indigenous people's rights risk was not accounted for and resulted in some negative outcomes for the companies. So the first case you all know about is the Dakota Access Pipeline. So 2 years prior to the Energy Transfer Partners breaking ground on the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe stated that they did not consent to the project, citing concerns of harm to their water sources and community. So the Energy Transfer Partners did not disclose this fact to its shareholders. And the result is that Standing Rock and other impacted tribes protested and engaged stakeholders while amassing a potent global scale movement, which resulted in $3.8 billion projects exceeding to $12 billion. Despite litigation culminating in 2022 in favor of the tribes, their water supply is still in danger of irrevocable contamination. So this is one example. I guess the expenses have risen almost threefold as a result of Indigenous people's rights risk not being accounted for, not being taken into consideration, and not informing the shareholders properly about the risk. The second case I wanted to share about is the Cobre Panama case you probably have all heard about at the end of last year. It's about the project that was approved in 1997. And in October of last year, the people of Panama took it into the streets to demonstrate in all provinces against the project. And to the government's surprise, the young people organized themselves. And by end of October, and then into November, they had, I think, over 100,000 people on the streets. So the government had no choice but to respond to this uprising, resulting into signing a moratorium against the mining project and announcing that the law that they had to establish the mining contract was declared unconstitutional. And that put a definitive end to these first quantum minerals mine project, or Cobre Panama project in Panama. So just wanted to bring that civil unrest, protesting can happen if you do not engage with indigenous peoples properly. It may result in a loss of a project completely. So the third project is the case in Guatemala. You have also probably heard about this landmark verdict by the Inter-American Court that marked a monumental step in a 4-decade struggle for indigenous land rights. And it was a huge, lengthy and arduous legal battle that led to the win against the state of Guatemala. According to the verdict, the Guatemalan government violated the rights of indigenous Kichi people to properly being consulted by permitting mining on land where members of the community have lived at least since the 1800s. Indigenous people's lives on Lake Isabel. And in its written sentence, the court linked the human rights violations to inadequacies in domestic law, which failed to recognize indigenous property and ordered the state to adopt new laws. So this case is really monumental. And since it was decided at the highest level of the Inter-American Court, it has the potential to have the ripple effect throughout the legal regime. And as Leonardo Cripa, who was the attorney for the case, he stated that it was a once-in-a-century advance for indigenous rights in Guatemala and internationally. So we're really looking forward to the implementation of this case and seeing how this case could be also applied throughout the Americas and beyond. So the fourth case is the Australian case. You've also probably heard about this, that despite having an indigenous peoples policy, Australian mining giant Rio Tinto destroyed the sacred Juuka Gorge. And the result of that was that in addition to 46,000 years of human history and integral cultural and spiritual places of Aboriginal people in Western Australia, this was lost forever. And the company C-suite was terminated because of that. And shareholders ousted board members without remuneration packages. And global operations have come under sharp scrutiny. So these are just 4 cases, and I think that the list will keep being populated as we gather more evidence about how, if indigenous people's rights risk is not accounted for, what would happen to a project that is not properly consulting and going through a protocol of free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples.
Thank you very much, Galina.
Those are great examples. There's a ton. I mean, especially in Latin America, there's amazing stories coming from there about interactions between protesters or activists. People are trying to just design different kinds of ways of interacting with mining in the context of climate. Ecuador is a hotspot to look at. There's stories always from there. People have been very smart about interacting with companies and government. Peru as well. So maybe to tie back to the question. So the kinds of complications that a windfall may present. I mean, the kinds of questions are like, where are the revenues going and where's the capital coming from? And so in addition to the cities I mentioned before, like the UK and Canada, also China, if you speak Chinese, if you're able to access some records online, that's immensely valuable because that's where a lot of decisions are being made. And then I think Galina already mentioned this, but Chile is trying to rewrite its regulations regarding lithium. There are problems with that, but it raises incredible discussions. Similar things are happening in Southern Africa. Zambia is one, especially. So this question also refers to the IMF estimates. I think as journalists, it's very valuable to recognize where conflict of interest plays in. And so the IMF is a bank and mining companies are huge financial institutions. They live by the understanding or predicting what the future is going to be like. So the expectation of a windfall is what mining companies and banks want to happen so that they can grow their business. And I think it's perfectly fine to question whether mining needs to play as large a role or the role that it is playing now into the future, because we don't know how EVs, wind turbines, solar panels will spread around the world. There's immense opportunity for trying to just redesign the entire energy transition. And so expecting a windfall will come and reporting it and writing that in articles may also be a self-fulfilling prophecy as well.
Fantastic responses. And actually, you both have touched upon this, and it's a great segue into our next question, which is the cartelization of this process. Is there a risk, you have already answered this question, but is there a risk that the mineral trade as a whole can be cartelized in the way that oil has been? What are some of those key concerns that journalists should be staying on top of over the coming years?
Yeah, I'll be very short since I've mentioned that before, that Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile, possibly now Peru, are thinking about creating a cartel. But what I've recently learned that in Bolivia, they're increasingly facing towards Russia and China. They're currently a contract with Russia, with Russian Rosatom. I believe actually a couple of companies that having direct contracts. Bolivia at the moment. And yeah, it is a huge concern on our end from the indigenous people's perspective that, well, while we have some leverage for change in certain countries, right? So when it poses a great risk, a country makes that decision to have a relationship with certain countries, let me say that. And there's a closing space. We're already facing the closing space for civil society and indigenous peoples, and that might pose kind of greater risks for that space to close completely.
Yeah, let's see. So minerals operate differently from oil. And one of the biggest things about it is that minerals can be recycled. A lot of minerals can. And so that would, like the EU with their regulations on creating incentives for battery recycling, labels, certain kind of domestic markets for things that are already imported from outside, that could counter cartels or at least decrease their power. But I think when we talk about cartels, we're also talking about the concentration of power and who determines prices. And that definitely is a big conversation, because the people determining prices, they're not even battery companies. They're not mining companies. They're often financial groups that operate in these cities where the capital is located, stock exchanges or otherwise. And that, in addition to the concentration of processing in China, those open up, very valid questions. I think you'll often see reactions to the concentration of power in China as, especially in the US, kind of hawkish policy. We have to make sure to bring the mining back home, or at least into friendly countries. There are a number of academics who have written extensively criticizing this approach, because especially if it's for climate action, then there should be a lot more cooperation, and antagonism doesn't help that. In addition, this is the concept of onshoring, where you try to break up the concentration of power of this cartel that exists in China and bring it to again, friendly countries or within the US, I think those kinds of discussions often brush right by the fact that no country actually has implemented the kinds of free, prior, and informed consent protocol that is in UNDRIP, which is this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is, at least what a lot of sources have said, is what the best protocol for FPIC, for this consent protocol, but it's not actually implemented anywhere. So to bring it into the US may not be necessarily better, as we're seeing in the US, wouldn't be necessarily better than other places. So there's a lot, bigger questions, I guess, to ask about who has power in creating this large scale mining. There's a lot of opportunity for redesigning it in different ways.
Just wanted to add about also, it's worth paying attention to self cooperation as well. I think that I've been in some conversations where people are like thinking through building direct supply chains, let's say Indonesia and Chile and others, like through self cooperation, possibly building a production in some of the resource-rich countries directly and bringing all of the resources through self cooperation. It sounds really great on the outset, but the thing is, like, the impacts will still remain. It doesn't matter whether it's global north, global to south cooperation. It still means that indigenous peoples' lands and territories are going to be impacted by that development. So in some ways, like, I fear there will be a bit less accountability and protections, but maybe you're challenge me if you think I'm not correct in that, but I feel there might be less protections and accountability and safeguards for indigenous peoples. But again, we have to see. We just have to monitor. Yeah.
I can bring up a quick example of just
go ahead.
Well, there is a challenge to that. I don't know, but the example of Indonesia where they limited nickel ore exports. This was very impactful. This is a policy that they started in 2014, and it's led to a lot of domestic nickel processing expansion, and is continuing today. This policy of limiting the export of ore and encouraging processing domestically is something that other countries have been looking at as well. So this is a kind of south to south coalition or cooperation that could be there, but at the same time, Indonesia has had a lot of problems with the expansion of those things, because they prioritize reeling in a lot of capital and building up as quickly as possible. And so while the countries in the south of south cooperation, so in Southern Africa, there are countries that are considering and referring to Indonesia's policies. If that kind of plan goes ahead, then there will definitely be questions about, how to uphold the rights of people that nearby.
We're going to actually come back to this subject, but let's talk a little bit here about the environmental impacts. So some of our listeners may be aware that there was a UN report about a couple months ago that said that the extraction of raw materials could rise by 60% by 2060. And so there's obviously a lot of questions from that. So what kinds of environmental impacts and planetary boundaries are of the highest concern in regard to the extraction of these minerals? And which ones should journalists be looking into right now?
Oh, I can probably start on that. So I will start with air quality as number one. Mining construction and operations can degrade air quality very quickly. The second is tailings. More than 220 million metric tons of mine waste is dumped into waters each year by mining companies, affecting aquatic life and polluting drinking water. Tailing dumpings destroy coral reefs, riverbeds, and seabed floors. There is no feasible technology to remove and treat tailings from the water after they've been dumped. 3, it's excess water consumption, affecting aquatic life, causing drought and worsening climate change. An example is Salton Sea in Lithium Valley. In Chile, we mentioned Chile, right? So there are projects that are proposed in the Atacama Desert. I was just there last month, and it's extremely dry area. Water is very scarce, but still they're planning to extract lithium that requires just a lot of water. That water, where is it coming from? and how our people are supposed to live without water. So the fourth is loss of biodiversity and habitat destruction. A year ago, I was in Chile, but I was visiting other areas, such as Araucania, the land of Mapuche people. And I spent a day and a half in San Antonio municipality, or the town of Jujejo, where indigenous Mapuche group is fighting against the expansion of the existing deep water port, which is currently about a mile long. And the plan is to expand it throughout the beach to about 4 miles. And I was thinking, like, why exactly, what's the reason for this expansion? They have been historically been servicing the wine industry and the copper industry. And I started hypothesizing that it may be servicing the lithium industry, as EU and US are rushing to establish bilateral relationships with Chile for lithium export. And this is just the only deep water access to the Chilean coast. All the while, the plan is to destroy the sacred sites of the Mapuche Lafcanche people, which is the people of the sea. Lafcanche people are people of the sea, and they host traditional ceremony on the beaches. And that's exactly the beach on the other side, right next to the port, where the community there hosts their traditional sacred ceremony. And right next to it is I always forget this in English, but in Spanish, humedale, the marshlands, these extremely important biodiversity area, a home for the local bird species. And for a lot of indigenous peoples, our sacred sites are not just, it's not a coincidence that a sacred sites overlaps with an important biological hotspot, biodiversity hotspot. So these are the kinds of things that I think that indigenous peoples are facing, because not only the loss of the species, but also it has huge social impact, because mining never comes alone. It has impacts throughout the area, with the processing facility building, construction of new ports in this case, but also increased rates of diseases because of air pollution, cardiovascular diseases, lots of stress, man camps. I did notice quite a heavy atmosphere in that town of Jujejo. At night, there are hordes of young men walking around in intoxicated state, missing and murdered indigenous women. It's been a huge problem. And lost children, and it just comes with a host of different issues. It's not just biodiversity issues. So that's just a few I wanted to mention and give an example.
Yeah, I think that was a perfect answer. I think I'll just emphasize that tailings, this is mine waste. It's the largest product of a mine, but mining companies ignore it or often think of it as an afterthought, even though they may produce 99 times more waste than they do the actual mineral they sell. I'll emphasize the water as well. Mining companies aren't water companies. They need a lot of water to process all that rock. Air quality, I'll emphasize as well, is, the mining industry is, I think, 10% roughly of global emissions. And when you need power at a project, often the easiest power is diesel, coal. That's always a very important question for any project starting up. So ask that as a journalist. And then I'll also say, in evaluating the environmental impacts, one, there's a lot of impacts that can't be quantified. And this is the kind of cultural impacts that Galina was speaking about. Those are very valuable and deserve a lot of time in an article. And then the data that can be quantified, the information that can be quantified, should be put against the company's baseline study. Every mining company needs a baseline study. Ask about that. If they say that there was a certain kind of impact or there wasn't, ask the data, ask to show it against what had been there previous to the mine. Those are all very, firm questions that need to be posed by journalists.
Great. Thank you both. In the interest of time, I am going to jump forward to a question I think is very important because we've brought up Indigenous rights consultation quite a few times, and so we need to talk about that. So from start to finish, there are these procedural requirements that mining companies and governments have to follow or are supposed to follow to respect Indigenous and human rights. However, they're really technical. They require a lot of research, and they can be marred in national politics. And so because of this, journalists sometimes don't understand or address these legal processes in their reporting on these, which often help assess which sources are legally in the right. So what tips or resources can you share with journalists to help them better understand and report on the technicalities in the consultation, consent, and grievance processes?
Galina, you can go ahead. I feel you're more the expert here.
Yeah. So as we've all mentioned, there's the minimum standard for Indigenous peoples' rights, which is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, right? So the free, prior, informed consent is enumerated as a collective right of Indigenous peoples to free, principle number 1, prior, principle number 2, informed, third principle, and consent. So to date, none of the nation states have met the minimum requirement of free, prior consent, unfortunately. And it is, we are taking it upon ourselves as Indigenous leaders, as Indigenous activists, and our communities to uphold these rights. And another thing I wanted to emphasize that FPIC is the right of Indigenous peoples. It's not the right of a companies, business, or governments. It's the right that belongs to Indigenous peoples. Therefore, Indigenous peoples are currently getting themselves ready and equipped to develop their own FPIC protocol. And it's the requirement for all companies coming to the Indigenous peoples' lands and territories to get themselves acquainted with those protocols that are put forward by Indigenous communities themselves. We at SIRGE Coalition, we have developed a guidebook or guidelines of free, prior, informed consent, but that are specifically written for Indigenous leaders and their communities. Where to start, what to know, what to take into consideration, and who to talk to. And we provide a list of resources. Again, I can provide those resources to you, Mike, after this webinar so that you can send it for redistribution.
Absolutely. You can send them to me and I'll put them in the show notes.
Perfect.
So I'll just mention a few things. So as journalists, probably understood, try as hard as possible to contact people who will be affected by mines, people who live close. Ask your editors for more funding or translation or whatever, more time, whatever it may be. It immensely helps the story. It also is about doing justice to people there and not just to a company that can pay for its own PR. Yes, to emphasize again, when the company says that, oh, we followed the law, we get close to FPIC, whatever it is, there's no country where the law is enough. So keep asking that. I mean, FPIC itself is not a box you check. It's ongoing. So when they say, oh, we've done consent, that's not a good enough answer. It's how do you continue the consents people engaged? Also, as journalists, timelines are very important. When were certain permits received? When was capital received? When were permits received? When were things published? When does construction begin? And is there consent on this? Certificate on this? I think another thing is that when you do contact people who live near mines or proposed mines, mining companies, whether deliberately or not, they often divide communities. So people will be on various sides of a debate, and it's valid to include everyone's, of course, but be aware that some of the reason for the divide may be because suddenly there's a multinational company that's offering who knows what to some people. Mining also, they will say that a lot of companies say that they generate jobs. Mining is increasingly automated and increasingly controlled by people not really close to the mine at all. So if they're going to create jobs, where are these jobs? Where they specifically, have they agreed actually to create or sign something committed to creating a certain number of jobs and maintaining those jobs? And then last thing is maybe counterintuitive and maybe intuitive, but talk to companies as much as possible because they likely will want to talk to journalists. And if they don't want to talk to journalists, that's very significant. But if you can, engage on their level a little bit, they will have a lot of information that is valuable for the public to know. And journalists have a unique position to funnel that information to the public. And that's what, and of course, analyze their answers. Allow yourself to be a little bit critical.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to uplift what Ian was saying about the conquer and divide strategy, that it happens all the time when a company comes and they think that it's a great idea to go into a community and buy somebody's votes off. And I just wanted to share that does not constitute true FPIC. So at times like that, we really break trust. If a company really wants to have a conversation with community and co-design an FPIC protocol or an engagement, this is not the way to do. This is not the way to approach a community. And we've had so many cases with the oil and gas industry and mining, traditional mining, when a company will just buy a few leaders in the community and then they say they've got the consent. But does not constitute true FPIC. And I think for reporters, it's important to really do their homework and to meet with community members to understand the situation. And usually when we do site visits, we learn a lot what's happening on the ground, because just having a good conversation over dinner or a cup of tea and it's just spending a little bit of time to understand provides a lot of information. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Galina. We have time for one more short question before we're going to open the floor to audience questions. And I understand there's actually quite a few questions we had planned that we didn't get to, so we may address some of those really quick though. So a arguably key ingredient to the energy transition is the recycling of minerals, which research indicates could replace between 25% and 55% of mining over the next 2 decades. So what are your thoughts on this? What are some stories journalists should be looking into regarding the improved efficiency and life cycle of transition minerals?
So let's see. Recycling is this piece of the circular economy. It's only one piece of a circular economy. There's also repair, there's reuse. There's a lot of reuse. I think a few things to know about the conversations that are happening within recycling is that lots of people within the industry itself even will say that recycling isn't a problem to be addressed now, because for something like EV batteries, we don't have enough material built up to start the recycling process. That's a common refrain. I think there's a few things to inject into that conversation. One is, if we don't think about recycling right now, we're going to end up with a lot of batteries that are very difficult to process, and then we won't be able to get all the materials we can from there. Another piece is that recycling is often thought of as very expensive. That's always expensive relative to mining. So with mining itself, if the costs of mining were actually incorporated into mining new materials, then recycling would have a chance. So there's this really uncomfortable imbalance where it's just cheap to get land and start mining, cheap in the sense relative to building recycling capacity. But there's very valid points to bring recycling into a conversation about reforming mining. They work in the same market. Let's see. Yeah. So if possible, so I started within mining, but then I realized conversations like this with recycling were also about the design of the batteries themselves, or design of products much further down the line. Because once you start designing batteries or products better, or design them for recycling, then it is so much more easy, so much cheaper as well to get the materials from them. And even the materials that are very cheap to mine, we have the technologies to get them from batteries, things like graphite, which is the biggest component in a lithium ion battery. We know how to recycle those and re-inject them into the market. It's about then incorporating the cost of mining into that conversation. Yeah, recycling is a huge topic. It's not always necessarily about recycling itself. It could be repair, it could be reuse. I think maybe one other thing to inject into this is that when we determine how much recycling is needed or how much it can, like the stat that was given in this question is that recycling could replace 25% to 55%, depending on the mineral and depending on the model of this future scenario. It could replace that huge chunk. That is a chunk of what is expected to be sold later. And there are many different reports out that try to model what demand for certain metals will be in the future. Those models deserve a lot of scrutiny because there's decisions within it about how large certain batteries are, which materials they use, the rate at which they are sold, as well as the ecosystem that they're sold into. Things like how many charging ports exist. Do we need super high functioning batteries, or can we go for cheaper batteries? Are we doing more buses, public transportation, which we need other kinds of energy? And for that kind of thing, there was a great report out that used modeling as activism from the climate and community projects. I could send that link later. And that was a really interesting, piece to bring to this conversation, where we have like the World Bank and several consultancies predicting how much will be in demand. Once you incorporate some kind of justice into the implementation of climate action, it drastically changes how much people think is going to be in demand. And in demand, of course, is like this economic term that doesn't mean that like people are sitting there demanding it. It's more like the companies are producing, and because the companies are producing, it will be sold later, or it's cheaper sold. There's a lot of decisions there, and the use of the language, especially that journalists use in their stories, adds to this. And this is also about using the word need, whether we would need a certain amount of lithium or need nickel to do this. Who's determining the need? What does need really mean? And is it really determined by people who will be affected by it? It's not even determined by me, who I'm supposed to be a consumer of it. I'm not needing this. I can do other things for transportation. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Ian. Galina, do you have anything to add?
I just support Ian in everything that you said and appreciate what you said. And I just wanted to throw the R&D in the mix, research and development. I think we're not standing still in terms of research and development, and that I hope that new batteries will come online sooner or later that do not require massive amounts of this transition minerals. And I also wanted to challenge the assumption that 300 mines are needed before 2035. That was the estimate. I believe that came from all of the studies that you've mentioned. And if you take like a whole range of things that need to happen at the same time, including the research and development, including reuse and recycling and repair, including batteries design that don't take all of the entire car, right? So that can lead to a different story. And that will lead to a different demand in numbers. So that's what I wanted to uplift here. And also I wanted to bring up the question around the pledge from UNFCCC from COP28. I think we need to cover that. And if any of the reporters who are following this could cover this upcoming COP29 in Azerbaijan. Since we had that pledge of nation states to triple renewable energy without any safeguards in place for indigenous peoples and other mining affected communities, how is this going to play out? And what do we need to do to make sure that UN is also accountable with their pledges? And I also feel that there is a disconnect from what I read and hear between the UN Secretary General and his commitments to justice and human rights and the rest of the system. They're all like rushing, we're going to implement the SDGs, which will not be achieved, guaranteed. but we have to have those safeguards in place.
Thank you very much, Galina. Before we move on to our audience questions, and we have a couple, Galina, you've mentioned that story right there, which obviously I encourage reporters to look into. And we've covered a lot of concerns about indigenous human rights here. So what are some other big stories that journalists should be looking into regarding indigenous rights that we haven't covered that you want journalists to be looking at?
I can start. I think place-based stories are absolutely crucial. Place-based stories. We need to cover Indonesia, what's happening in Indonesia. It is scary. It is heartbreaking. These are people who also want the same things as we all do. We want to live and breathe good air. They want to eat good food, and they don't have to be attacked. They shouldn't be attacked and displaced and put in harm's way. The construction of these 14 coal plants, Halmahera, need to be covered. Thacker Pass, lithium mining by Lithium America needs to be covered. Limestone extraction in Nepal. The story with the silica extraction in Manitoba in Canada. Espinar province in Peru, copper mine by Glencore. I would love several stories on Glencore. Glencore is the worst offender of human rights, of indigenous people's rights. They're going to be featured as the worst offender in the transition minerals tracker that will be the second iteration of that will be released fairly soon by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Atacama Desert in Chile, and speaking directly to the affected community representatives, it would be key. Just bringing the stories to light, and many more coming. By the way, the one in the project that will impact indigenous Sami people, the rain herders in Sweden, in the Kiruna village. I think it's very important to cover that story as well. The only indigenous peoples that live in the territory of Europe.
Great. Thank you so much, Galina. All right. With that said, we're going to address some audience questions. This is a pretty interesting question. So it's from Nat. Certification schemes like the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA, are becoming a major industry within policy. Are these just another form of greenwashing?
Maybe Galina should start with that one.
So I would say that the SIRGE Coalition would not endorse any certification schemes. Our first and foremost priority are indigenous peoples, right? So we exist only for the reason of supporting indigenous people's priorities and their interests. And if that means for communities in their self-determined way, they want to engage in some ways with IRMA, for example, we would have to follow their recommendation. But if they say, no, we do not want to engage with IRMA, we don't. So again, in our work at SIRGE Coalition, our North Star, we are guided by the principles and the collective right of self-determination. And that means that indigenous peoples have the right to say yes or no, or maybe, or yes with conditions. There's a spectrum of decisions. Again, has been so much misunderstanding in the history of indigenous peoples' movement of what self-determination really means, right? We have to be very clear what it means. That if an indigenous community wants to engage in a project, in a transition minerals mining project, this is their right. The only thing that we can do on our end is to provide ample, complete information and disclosure and demand that the company provides full disclosure of potential impacts so that the community can make decisions fully informed. That's the essence of FPIC, free, prior, and informed. And then it may lead either to consent or withholding consent. When we talk to companies, we say, plan for the now. in any negotiation, plan for the no. You can design for the no. But you can also arrive to a yes. It depends on the community. It doesn't depend on me, an outsider of a community, or anybody else.
Great. Thank you very much. Actually, there's a really good follow-up question here from Joseph. And Joseph asks, are there any examples of community-led transition minerals extraction that could be considered good examples?
I've looked. I have not found any. It's very difficult to have anything but a corporate large-scale mine and be able to sell minerals, process minerals. The nature of the market is that there's a lot of capital that are pushing down prices and making it very cheap to get land and process minerals and sell them into the market. I would be extremely curious to find something that's community owned, that's more modular, that's smaller scale. If anyone has a story on that, absolutely explore it. But this is a really valuable question, and I think one that journalists should have on their minds constantly. What are the kinds of very, very deliberate alternatives to large-scale mining, and how can that work in this current kind of globalized capital way? And I can add on maybe to the IRMA question.
Sure, yeah.
I know IRMA pretty well. They're great people. I think this should also be seen in the greater private sector regulating itself sphere. And there's a lot of great researchers who have tried to examine how these things work, because initially there's a lot of hope and optimism. There's a lot of smart people that have access to company records that can try to push them in certain ways. IRMA is generally thought of as one of the best. Their primary goal is transparency. So getting companies to get their data, their operations out in public and engage with people. And there's a lot of value to that, especially for journalists and researchers, because they can look at this data as well, to look at the reports. And there's a bit of a required ongoing transparency as well. So to engage on one of these reports with the company is valuable for journalists to get access. I think within the private sector regulating itself kind of sphere, that's something that the EU, there's some interesting people in the EU who have tried to contest regulations that may possibly prioritize certification schemes. And their contention is that it'll just displace what the government should be doing. And people within IRMA as well will also say that the government really, they are not a stand-in for government. Actual regulation and enforcement is the best thing. This is a kind of mid-step, but the contentions are a bit that groups like this enable certain kind of a bit of greenwashing, but enable also access to indigenous communities because they bring a banner and a sense that they're doing the right thing. But these things operate in systems, and just to get a kind of certification may not address that. For example, in Chile, water is already privatized. And so if a company is going to say that they've done everything they can to uphold the law in Chile may not uphold the rights of people. So in many countries, and not to just focus on Chile, but it's complicated, and those certification schemes deserve to be engaged with. They'll give great interviews in a lot of detail, but they're systemic. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Ian. Audience, thank you so much for all the questions that you're posing. We really only have time to cover one more. And so I think I'm going to choose this one here because we haven't talked about it yet. But it's from Victor. And Victor is asking, should we also cover deep sea mining, particularly the negotiations to establish the international regulation to start this kind of mining? I think that's a good question to breach this topic briefly before we leave here.
Yeah, Ian, do you want to cover that?
Yeah, I can. So covering deep sea mining, I think there's a lot of value to it if it's done responsibly. Unfortunately, there's some coverage of it that's I don't feel is responsible. And what I mean by that is understanding that your sources in deep sea mining may have conflicts of interest. So talking to a company, or sometimes even talking to regulators like the ISA, they have conflicts of interest in allowing mining to go forward. So there's a lot of great scientists who have complex opinions about this and that are not connected. I think they'd be willing to have very interesting interviews to help shed light on numerous perspectives. So seek them out for a kind of a bit more of a bird's eye view. one of the things that doesn't seem to be often put in deep sea mining stories is that when companies say that deep sea mining is better than land mining, even just disregarding whether that's actually the case, it will likely never be true that only deep sea mining would happen and there would be no land mining. So it's not as if they would just replace the production. It would always be added production. When you add more production to this globalized economy, people are just going to consume more. So the idea even that it would replace terrestrial mining is likely not going to be the case. It'll just add more stuff for people to consume. And that's a bit of the idea, because there's a bit of a nervous feeling among investors about where the minerals are going to come from. But again, that's connected to who's determining whether certain things are needed and certain things are in demand. Yeah, there's an additional piece to this, which I wrote for Mongabay a while back, which is about where liability lies if something goes wrong with deep sea mining. And this is a really interesting legal space because there are countries that have to sponsor the companies doing the mining in these zones where there's no national jurisdiction. And it's possible that liability may fall to them if there's massive damages, such as to like tuna supply or to coral reefs or to whatever it may be. And so it's possible that the countries that are also sponsoring deep sea mining may end up being on the hook for a huge bill that they can't pay for. And unfortunately, the companies, because the way they're set up financially, it's possible for them not to care because they can cash out and leave. That's the case for a lot of shareholders. And so, yeah, maybe to conclude on that point, it's the companies doing this are no one's located in this area except for people who don't have voices. By people, I also mean species, as well as the possible emissions that may come from it. Yeah, I don't know. Do it really carefully if you're going to do it, and emphasize conflict of interest, because it's everywhere. It's ridiculous. And final point, deep sea mining is a 30-year-old idea. They thought about it in the 1990s when nobody was thinking about nobody in power was thinking about the impacts of mining. Or they thought that the ocean was a kind of just toilet where you could put a lot of pollution. Like dilution is the best pollution or something.
Dilution is the solution to pollution.
Yeah. And so that was from the 90s. That idea is from the 90s. Even the people in power right now, values have changed, but there's still a lot of momentum that carries on from that time. So it's not even that they're making conscious decisions about this stuff. So, okay, I'll leave it there.
Galina, do you have one more point to add there?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the question that was asked regarding cases, or positive cases, or cases when Indigenous peoples or communities were engaged in partnership. So I don't know a good case myself, but next week I am going to attend a conference organized by Business and Human Rights Resource Center in partnership with Indigenous Peoples' Rights International and Right Energy Partnership. And they will be presenting on shared prosperity and co-management models of Indigenous peoples with companies and providing those examples there. So I'm looking forward to learn. And as I mentioned to you before, is that I don't know everything. I know something. So I hope that was helpful, but I look forward to learning more about those shared prosperity and co-management models and share it later with you.
Great, thank you. And yes, your perspective is immensely helpful, and as was yours, Ian. All right, everyone. That is all the time we have for. So I just want to give a big thank you to our panelists here for providing such an informative discussion on this really complex and ongoing developing topic. If you want to listen to or watch other conversations in the Mongabay webinar series, we recommend following our live stream page on Mongabay's YouTube channel at Mongabay TV, where you can see past and future discussions, or by subscribing to Mongabay's newsletter, where you can sign up to participate in discussions like this. As always, if you're enjoying the Manga Bay Newscast or any of our podcast content like our sister series, Manga Bay Explores, and you want to help us out, we encourage you to spread the word about the work we're doing by telling a friend. Word of mouth is definitely the best way to help expand our reach, but you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/mangabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so even just $1 per month does make a difference and helps us offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you like our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/mangabay to learn more and support the Manga Bay Newscast and all of our podcast content. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Manga Bay Newscast over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either App Store for the Manga Bay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And you can also read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mangabay.com or follow us on social media via our accounts on LinkedIn at Manga Bay News and on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Manga Bay. Thanks as always for listening.